Good morning. I'm Jonathan Fanton, the president of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to this program, Stewarding America, Institutions and Civic Life. I'd like to thank the Civics Renewal Network, the Annenberg Public Policy Center, and especially Academy Fellow Kathleen Hall-Jamieson for including the Academy in this national celebration of Constitution Day. Kathleen has been an advisor to the Academy's Stewarding America project and is a member of our Commission on the Humanities and Social Sciences. We're grateful that she's invited us here to continue the important conversations that those works have inspired. In different ways, both of these projects address important challenges to our democracy. The Stewarding America project, chaired by Norman Ornstein of the American Enterprise Institute, investigates the ways in which our civic institutions inspire and model good citizenship. The project has organized several programs around the country, as well as the spring 2013 issue of our journal Daedalus, American Democracy and the Common Good. This issue examined what it means to be a good citizen in the modern era and what it would take to revitalize a spirit of cooperation in American political life. No easy task, as we all know. Our Commission on the Humanities and Social Sciences was formed in response to a bipartisan call from U.S. Senators Lamar Alexander and Mark Warner and Representatives Tom Petrie and David Price. It was co-chaired by Duke President Richard Broadhead and John Rowe, the retired chair of Exelon Corporation. The Commission released its influential report, The Heart of the Matter, last year. Among its many recommendations, The Heart of the Matter emphasizes the knowledge and skills that Americans need to participate meaningfully in the democratic process, including a basic understanding of history and civics. As some of you may know, the Academy was founded in 1780 by John Adams, James Bowdoin, John Hancock, and other leaders who helped to establish the new nation, its government, and its constitution. The Academy's founders believed that a strong republic must be grounded in open discourse, engaged scholarship, and an informed and active citizenry. Adams was the intellectual leader of the early Academy and its principal founder. In his letter accepting the presidency of the Academy, he described his vision for the institution, a vision of intellectual exchange and collaboration in service of the public good. He said, and I quote, "The unanimity with which the members of this Academy are attached to the union of our American states, their constitutions of government, and the federal administration is the happiest omen of the future peace, liberty, safety, and prosperity of our country." John Adams. We continue to concern ourselves with the peace, liberty, safety, and prosperity of our country, often by convening leaders from many disciplines and professions to think together about common challenges but also opportunities. Just yesterday, we published a new report recommending long-term policies for U.S. science and technology research. The report, entitled Restoring the Foundation, the Vital Role of Research in Preserving the American Dream, underscores the importance of research in driving innovation. It recommends increased federal support for basic research, reducing administrative burdens on researchers, and forming a robust partnership among universities, industry, and government to advance scientific discovery. And it reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge, scientific and humanistic knowledge alike, is crucial, absolutely vital to the prosperity of our country and the preservation of the American dream. This morning, several distinguished leaders from education, law, philanthropy, and government have joined us to discuss the current state of American civic life and to think with us about how we might restore a sense of common good. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Norman Ornstein, who will introduce the panelists. And after the panel, there'll be a chance for you to ask questions give comments, and so this is a discussion. Norm is resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He writes a weekly column for Roll Call called Congress Inside Out, and has served as senior counselor to the Continuity of Government Commission. With his occasional writing partner, Tom Mann of Brookings, Norm was named a top global thinker by Foreign Policy magazine, and I quote, for diagnosing America's political dysfunction. Norm was elected a fellow of our Academy in 2004, and we're grateful for his leadership of our Stewarding America project and for serving as moderator of today's conversation. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Norman Ornstein.
As our panelists come up, let me start by saying in this very challenging time for the civic future of the country, it is heartening at least that we have these remarkable institutions to form the Civics Renewal Network. And I'm particularly grateful to Kathleen Hall Jamieson, who has been a leader in this effort for many, many years. And of course to the Academy, which has spearheaded this effort that I've been a part of on institutions and the common good. Let me introduce briefly the members of the panel that we have. I'm going to move a little bit so I can see you. You have bios, so I won't go into great detail. But starting here, Pat Wald served for many years as Chief Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, a judge for the International Criminal Tribunal in Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, has had a long and distinguished career in the law and is also a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, a deserving recipient, which is the highest civilian honor of the United States. Steve Hines is president of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, a long career in public and private sector service, founder of Demos, and served for many years in the Czech Republic with it was the East-West Institute, wasn't it, Steve? Trying to actually create both a dialogue and a building of institutions in places struggling to form democracies. Mickey Edwards served for 16 years as a member of Congress from Oklahoma, was chairman of the American Conservative Union. That's right, isn't it, Mickey? Yeah. And after leaving Congress, has had a distinguished career in academia and public service at Harvard, at Princeton, and now is the vice president of the Aspen Institute. Joel Klein had a wonderful career in the law for many years, served as a deputy counsel in the White House and then as assistant attorney general for antitrust, taking on some of the giants in the industrial and commercial world, is best known to people for leading for many years a dramatic effort at reforming the educational system in New York City, and now continues his efforts in the private sector with News Corp. So we're going to talk a lot about different institutions and about history. I'm going to give just a brief introduction. The Bechtel Foundation came to the Academy to do a project on citizenship, and we decided after some discussion that the best role that we could play would be to focus not on individual citizens, as many others were doing, but on the institutions that make up the fabric of the society, public and private institutions, and what they do or don't do or should do for the common good. We pulled a number of people together, had a lot of discussions. One consequence of it was a double volume of the Academy's journal, Daedalus, with a lot of people from different perspectives looking at institutions that ranged from Congress and the judiciary all the way through unions, corporations, foundations and philanthropy and many other areas. And to some degree, this panel is not the culmination of that effort because we're going to continue it. We're nowhere near done, but is a continuation of it. In that volume, Bill Galston of the Brookings Institution gave an introduction in which he noted that the Constitution begins with the three words, "We the people," not as Patrick Henry and other dissidents had driven for, "We the states," or anything else. And in a sense, it was the notion that the people combined were going to create that union. If you go to the preamble of the Constitution, it defines what this was about, what the common good was about a more perfect union, justice, domestic tranquility, the common defense, the general welfare, and the blessings of liberty. And as we move through the rest of the Constitution, it's pretty clear that the framers were defining the institutional means to achieve those goals for all. Now, what's also clear is that having functioning, respected governmental institutions is a key, but not the only way of doing that. And as Madison said in Federalist 62, the most deplorable effect of all is that diminution of attachment and reverence which steals into the hearts of people toward a political system which betrays so many marks of infirmity and disappoints so many of their flattering hopes. No government, any more than an individual, will long be respected without being truly respectable, nor be truly respectable without possessing a certain portion of order and stability. I read those words again last night and this morning while thinking that the latest survey that I saw has approval of Congress at 7%. That led to the natural question, who are these 7%?
Members of Congress.
Well, it brought me back to one theory, that they are heavily concentrated in areas that have legalized marijuana. But there's also what my friend John McCain said, that he and his colleagues are down to blood relatives and paid staff. And I told Senator McCain that I know many of his family, and that's a very shaky group as well. Anyhow, we do know that it's not just Congress that's under siege right now that has disappointed the hopes of so many people. We know that we're at a time in which almost every institution, public and private, is under enormous stress with a great deal of skepticism that people have towards leadership and the ability of those institutions to function the way we have wanted them to function. Some of this is a consequence of what has been a long and, for most Americans, disappointing period of economic stasis or worse. And we know that that often brings with it, built into the DNA of America, a kind of populism that brings with it a distrust of institutions and leaders. That's certainly a part of it. But for every institution save the military, and even there we've had our share of scandals and difficulties, it's very hard to find leaders who command broad and wide respect. And at the same time, of course, we're going through a period of what I call tribalism. This goes way beyond polarization, but a sense among far too many Americans that probably started in Washington but has metastasized out to the states and now very significantly to the public as a whole, that people on the other side of the political divide are not to be trusted and are in fact dangerous for the common good, and that if they're for it, we've got to be against it, even if we were for it yesterday. We've seen this play out in too many ways. Now, I want to just reflect for a minute or two more broadly on what the framers had in mind in the constitutional frame. They set up a Congress as the first branch of government, not a parliament. And it's not just a different word. It has a different meaning and conception of what kinds of institutions we would require to fulfill that vision of the common good. Congress comes from the Latin, meaning to come together. The whole idea was that people from disparate parts of the broad country, vast expanse, living dramatically different lives and coming from radically different backgrounds, would come together face to face, debate, deliberate, be able to see where others were coming from, perhaps put themselves in their shoes, and over that extended period of debate and deliberation, either come to some broader consensus or find ways to compromise, but end up with policies that would be seen as legitimate more widely. Now, Parliament, and the parliamentary system that we rejected, comes from the French word parler, meaning to speak. And of course, in a parliamentary system, you have a government. It's elected with elected representatives, an opposition party that opposes, the government unites, but the members of Parliament as a whole are more foot soldiers. They vote the way the government demands that they vote, and their role is more to speak. Most of you have seen question period in a Parliament. It's a different style, and it brings a different culture of government. At the same time, the framers set out a judicial branch that had to be independent, was designed to provide some check on the other branches, but also as the guarantor of the freedoms set out in the Constitution and its amendments. And that requires both respect for the other branches and their roles, and some broad common acceptance of what is the common good. Now, the framers knew that translating all of this into mechanisms to foster these common goals would not and could not be done by government institutions alone. It required that civil society, the web of outside interests and bodies that are interwoven in our culture and daily life. And as I said earlier, all of that is under challenge. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. What role institutions should play, what role they are playing, what we might do to make sure that we don't lose some of that fundamental fabric that is under siege right now at a very trying time in our democracy. So I want to start by asking Pat and Mickey, who have spent a good portion of their lives in government service, to talk about what they see as those fundamental roles for the judiciary, for Congress. And Pat, as well, I want to ask you, I had mentioned earlier, there's a wonderful new book called Judging Statutes, written by the Chief Judge of the Second Circuit Court of Appeals in New York, Bob Katzman, in which he not only talks about the difficulty that judges have reading statutes and interpreting their meaning and the different theories involved, but also about how fundamental it is that judges have a respect for the inherently political nature of Congress and the fact that, as Madison himself noted, making laws was going to be a messy, difficult, murky, and sometimes distasteful process. So take that anywhere you want to go, and then Mickey.
Okay. Well, I might add that in addition to the judicial experience you talked about, I spent 2 very tense years as the legislative liaison for the Department of Justice up on the Hill. So that was my introduction to the congressional part. And I will tell you that at my advanced age, those were probably the most 2 uncomfortable years of my entire legal career, because I found the process so unpredictable, as opposed to later on in my long experience on the courts. On the courts, at least you know, if you're a judge, the stuff is in front of you, and the record and the briefs and the oral arguments, and you know, you can go off on your own in the library and read something, but basically you're supposed to stay within those confines in making your decision. Whereas in Congress, it was always my experience as the government's liaison that when you went out the front door with the congressperson or their staff, somebody else came in the back door, and most of what you had done was probably going to be undone in the last half an hour. But anyway, with that background and going on later on, let me make a few general comments. I think it's interesting that, Norm, that you talked about what's actually in the Constitution about Congress, which my fellow judge on the circuit, Ab Mikva, used to always tell me, well, note, he had been a congressman. He said, note that it's Article 1 is Congress. Article 2 is executive, and Article 3 is the judiciary. But anyway, the Founding Fathers did spell out to some degree. We all know there's been a lot of interpretation, both by Congress itself and also by the courts to some degree, about Congress's powers. But if you lay down Article 1, Section 8, it's got a long list of what's delegated, the power to make laws about Congress, the power to declare war, the power about money, et cetera. It's a long rule. What I think is interesting, or I found interesting, is when you get to Article 3, you talked about the founders thinking of the judiciary as a checks and balance mechanism, and of course it was. But you remember the famous, is it 72? Well, anyway, the Alexander Hamilton Federalist paper that said they're probably going to be pretty weak because they don't have anybody to enforce their laws, no militia. They're dependent upon the Congress for the money to go there. And if you look at Article 3, and I just did recently, all it says really is that the federal judiciary, that their jurisdiction shall be cases, later on they talk about controversies, cases and controversies arising out of the Constitution. There's no nice delineation the way there is in Article 1. And basically what has happened, and this is of course my own theory, is the court has, sometimes with the help of Congress, but basically the court itself has gone on to define what arising under the Constitution means. There isn't even an explicit grant of judicial review, as you all know, in the Constitution, although by and large, I'm not a scholar, but by and large my own reading suggests that most of the people thought it was inherent in their power. But some were not so sure about judicial review of the courts over the acts of Congress or the acts of the executive. So really what's happened is that the courts have become, I think, the primary agent of constitutional change, because even despite the fact that we like to think of the Founding Fathers, and we should think of them as very prescient people, the fact is that they couldn't possibly create a document that would be good for all eternity. In fact, what Jefferson wanted to thought maybe we ought to throw it away after 30 years. So they did constitutional amendments, but they're very hard to, we've only had 27 in our history. They're a very formidable task to get a constitutional amendment in most cases. So it's basically the courts that have become the agent of constitutional change. Now I bring all that up because you emphasized in your opening remarks, Norm, about the need for the respect and the trust of the Congress and the courts and the executive in order to make this kind of constitutional mechanism operate. I just want to throw into the mix, the conversational mix, the fact that the way it has evolved, the court has taken for itself, a big piece of deciding what the Constitution means. And that may well be in keeping with what, although I'm not sure all the founders really thought about it in great detail. So there is perhaps a little tension in those two tasks, to be very trustful, looking for common ground, kind of respectful of the other institutions, and also the role they have taken on for themselves as saying, look, the Constitution, in order to continue and not to go and come the way constitutions do in other countries, it's got to, to accommodate change, or actually to institute, in my opinion, institute change. So I think sometimes those two roles come into conflict. I'll stop there.
Okay, before I get to Mickey, a couple of things I want you to think about, Pat, and I want to come back to. One is, as the court has taken on more and more of this role, we now live in an age where we see a lot of evidence that for many judges, the decisions become quite predictable based on one factor: what president nominated them. And we see 5-4 decisions on critical matters increasingly that seem almost tribal in nature. One could make a case that we've had this tribalism move down to the courts. I want to get your judgment on that and what you see as a challenge there. And the other question that I want to leave out there for everybody on the panel is, when I look at what's happened in the world of campaign finance, what worries me the most is what it will do with judicial elections. I'm with Sandra Day O'Connor, the former justice, on this one. Having so many judges elected now in a wild west of campaign finance, where the people who are going to put in money to defeat judges may well be those who have lost cases in front of them, and where judges have to raise large sums of money, and where are they going to turn to the people who practice in front of them. And I see that also as a fundamental challenge to a judiciary that's going to be respected and viewed as independent by the public, which is a necessary component of this. So that's a long set of questions that I hope we'll return to, and I hope everybody will address. But Mickey, when you were in Congress and after you left, you were one of the strongest defenders of the first branch of government, including at a time when many people who called themselves conservatives had disdain for it. You had a lot of slings and arrows that flowed from that. Now talk a little bit about what you see as, and what you did see as this fundamental as the first branch of government, and why it seems to bring such disdain, greater than we normally have, which is usually pretty high, in the public as a whole.
Well, thanks, Norman, and I'm glad to have a chance to be part of this with such good friends and distinguished group. I have a particular concern about what's been happening to Congress and the public perception of the Congress. Both the executive branch and the legislative branch are held in pretty low esteem at the moment. The Congress has low approval ratings, so does the president. But I'm particularly concerned about the Congress because under our system, almost every single major power of the federal government is in Congress. It's not in the executive branch. People forget that. They think of the president as the head of government, but we don't have a head of government, and if we did, it would probably be in the Congress, because that's where all the war power, the taxing power, the spending power, the appointment power all reside. And so when the public loses confidence in that ability to come together as you described it from all parts of the country, and come to solutions, then we have a real fundamental distrust in how our system works. Well, most of the time when something isn't working very well, you can go back and find that there's a systemic problem. We have a systemic problem in the way that our political system functions, not the governmental system. The constitutional system, I think, was a very good model, and I'm very fond of our Constitution and James Madison and all that, but the political system that we have allowed to evolve subsequently has created a lot of problems. Madison was very hopeful that as you allowed factions to challenge other factions and to come up with ways that as people gathered together and they listened to each other, and one interest challenged another interest, that nobody would gain excessive power. The political primary system, which came not from the Constitution, but came from the progressive movement in the late 1800s and early 1900s, sort of upset that with a good intent, so it wasn't just a bunch of cigar-smoking white guys sitting in a room deciding who would be the nominee for this or that, but the primary system has evolved into a closed party primary system in which members of Congress, when they get to Washington, are looking over their shoulders, not at their constituencies, not over all of the people, in my case, in central Oklahoma, or for other people in their own states, but at that small, hardcore, partisan, ideological group. that takes part in the primaries and the conventions that is not representative of the electorate as a whole, but we have this combination of two things. One is, well, three things. One is redistricting, doesn't really affect the Senate, but congressional redistricting where the parties are able to choose the voters rather than the other way around. I think that's a significant part of the problem. But we have this party primary system where I've used some examples, as you know, where I think a best example is a place like Utah, where they started with a convention, and little over 3,500 people were able to end the career of Senator Robert Bennett, because 46 states also have these sore loser laws that if you didn't win your party's nomination, even if there's only 3,500 people making that determination, you can't be on the general election ballot. So we no longer have the idea that the constituency as a whole has selected the people they want in Washington making these decisions, and the people who are now in Washington, in Congress, are over-responsive to the hardcore because they determine, who goes forward. So I'm not bothered by polarization. We have 312 million people in this country. We have lots of different views, lots of different life experiences. The polarization is not the problem. I talk about partisanship, you use the tribalization, and I think that's basically the problem. Now we're going to get into the civic community as a whole, where you get into the media and the talk shows and all of this stuff, and the money problem, which I know we're going to get into as well. But what's happened is that the idea of representative government, democracy, not the republic part, which is the structure of the government, but the democracy part, how we select the people who make the laws, is not working not because the Constitution failed, but because of the laws that we have put in place subsequently to the Constitution that have skewed the system very badly.
Good. A couple of things I want you to think about, Mickey, as well as the rest of the panel, that flow from some of what you said. You could make a case now that the framers' conception that at least these institutions would be responsive to a larger public will is going away. It's partly because you have congressional districts that are so insulated from broader national trends. You're going to win in a general election regardless. It's partly that these districts, because of maybe natural residential patterns, are becoming more homogeneous. But we also have a situation where the Senate, which was not designed to be democratic in the same way, but which had a disparity between the representation of the smallest states and the largest states that was reasonably large but not huge, that's now gone in a dramatically different direction. And basically senators who represent 10% of the population, and mostly coming from very small states that have very homogeneous populations, can dominate the process now. And that leads to some questions about whether this is moving in a direction that would have us think about larger change, maybe larger constitutional change, but that's for a little bit further down the road. Now, Joel, let me turn to you just for an initial question, and I'll do the same with Steve, and then we will open it up. I'm tempted to ask you about an earlier incarnation in your life, because you were there in the White House during years, the Clinton years, when one could argue that much of the tribalism really got generated. It was Newt Gingrich working to try and create a Republican majority in the House after what became 40 consecutive years of Democratic hegemony, which was not a healthy thing for the society. But instead, I want to talk about your passion that flowed from your own experience getting educated in the New York public schools, and then took you to the attempt to transform that system. You've got a lot of scars that flowed from that. And it involved a lot of institutions, a lot of factions out there. It also gets to a fundamental here, which is if we're going to have that sense of a common good, the educational system has to work in a fashion that both creates opportunities for everybody, but also gives them a grounding in the fundamentals of the society and civic education so that they can be good citizens. So use your experience a little bit to reflect on the failures or successes of those institutions and the challenges that
So
leads us
I
to.
think it fits into a theme that's been echoed that I'd like to underscore, which is you started with this notion the average American thinks his or her life is going to get worse, and certainly his or her children's lives are going to be worse. And that's a really unique moment when you see 70% of the people say, my kids' lives are going to be worse. So there's a kind of sense out there that something's amiss, and that virtually all the big players have a seat at the table, but the little person, the common good person, is sort of absent. And this is exacerbated by things like the amount of money that gets thrown into the system, the real sense that Washington is controlled by the dominant interests, that that's where people go. So that's the sort of view. When you come into a school system, you encounter that at a very sort of sensitive place, because it's where kids get their shot. And whatever parents' fears about the future, they do want their kids to be well educated, to have a better life, etc. But they have the sense, the same thing, that it's politics, it's unions, that it's not something that's designed or run well for the constituents, that is, the kids who go there. And so when you see, and at times, David Leonard's been doing a series of columns on this, fewer and fewer kids from the bottom quartile of the economic system are getting an opportunity to go to good colleges, whereas the kids at the top are all taking up all the spots. And that whole theme, when you see that most kids who are from minority and poor communities are really getting poorly educated today, put aside civic education, but poorly educated today, it gives you this sense of frustration, and at a time when it's not just job skills, but civic participation is going to require much, much more. And so I think there is a kind of sense out there that the institutions which are supposed to do the work that enable us to share a common good are increasingly being dominated by big, powerful forces on either side of the spectrum. And then the final point I would make is there's now something which I think is really awful, which is that somehow knowledge is something you can find in Wikipedia, so you don't have to learn it in school. And you can find information in Wikipedia, but you ain't going to find knowledge in Wikipedia. And there's a big difference between the two. And one of the impairments that stuck out for me, I'll never forget a class I walked into, and the teacher, the first question, well, what was the Civil War about? Slavery. Second question, what was slavery about? Racism. Third question, who here has recently experienced racism? And the rest of the class, we forgot about the Civil War, and we're talking about contemporary experience of racism. Not that that's irrelevant, but the lack of really building the kind of knowledge and intellectual foundations necessary for rich civic participation seemed to me to be a problem. So I think it's at both levels, Norm, in terms of what you're raising.
Let me follow on with that, because I've been struck by what's happened to the dialogue about the Common Core. And one could make a case that having even if there are variations from state to state, a common core of educational experiences, of topics and focus is a good way to try and build that sense of common good, but also create a different level of opportunity. A few years ago, there was a broad consensus on this that cut across party lines. It really was an idea that had come from conservative Republicans and been embraced by liberal Democrats. And now it's been completely caught up in the tribal wars, and people who were ardent supporters of it, like Bobby Jindal, the governor of Louisiana, have not only stepped away from it, but have moved entirely to the opposite end, denouncing it and basically saying it's evil. What's going on here?
So this is a classic, and I'm glad you brought it up, because it's paradigmatic of what's going on, which is the polarization, the tribalization, and the politics first. So basic point you just said, America needs standards in Mississippi, New York, Chicago, and elsewhere that are rigorous and demanding. 3/4 of our kids going to college need some form of remediation. What kind of system is that? So the states came together and did this, and virtually all the states, 45 out of 50, signed on to it. Are they perfect? No. But they're a pretty good template, and they give you at least a set of expectations of what it means to graduate high school educated. In some states now, you can graduate high school barely literate. So this was an important step forward. Two things happened, and Bill Bennett probably expressed it best when he was Secretary of Education. Said, America will never have national standards. Republicans don't do national, the Democrats don't do standards. And that's the coalition that came together on Common Core. All of a sudden, because Obama supported Common Core through incentives, which the federal government does all the time, all of a sudden this became, instead of Obamacare, it became Obama Core, and the right peeled off of it. And the arguments they've made are basically, this is Washington trying to get control of your kids' curriculum, which is absolutely preposterous. Meantime, on the other side of the spectrum, people were afraid that a more demanding set of standards would put higher and greater pressure on accountability systems, that we'd expect more from our teachers, more from our principals, more from our schools. So they joined forces. In the meantime, for all of the rhetoric, most states have stayed with the Common Core. And while I think it's not thriving the way I'd like to see it thriving, I don't think the impairment has been as great as all that. But you're absolutely right that the dialogue is nowhere commensurate with the importance or significance of the issue. Nowhere. It's all politicized.
So, Steve, you have spent a good portion of your life working not just in the philanthropic sector, but also in that segment of the private nonprofit sector trying to improve the lot of the political process here and abroad. We had an interesting essay in Daedalus that in many ways was quite critical of the philanthropic sector, surprisingly so in some ways, but basically said, what have they done lately? And no great innovations have come out the way they did in earlier eras, but also it's increasingly dominated by big money and a few small interests. What do you think about that? And what can we do, and what role can both institutions like Demos and foundations like the Rockefeller Brothers Fund play in making sure that we get to the right place?
Well, thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be part of this conversation, and I want to start an answer to that question, Norm, by saying, first of all, that I really appreciate what my panel colleagues have said, and I agree with them. But I want to inject a sense of real urgency about this. I think we are fundamentally in a period of democratic crisis in this country, a really serious crisis, which risks the failure of American promise. And if you look at history and you look at ancient Greece, what happened? A flourishing democracy, the birth of democracy. And over time, it eroded. The institutions became dysfunctional. Economic inequality soared. The super rich got richer and richer, and they distorted the process, they distorted the structure, they distorted the institutions, left the government with no capacity and with no stature in society, and Grecian democracy collapsed. Now, are we at that point now? No. But I think if we think about the Constitution as the place we begin, and where this conversation began today, if you look at the totality of the Constitution, it was an effort by the founders to create balance in society. Balance between government and the rest of society. Balance between the branches of government. Balance between the levels of government, federal, state, municipal. And balance between the value of individual freedom and the need for collective responsibility. And they knew that this balance was not going to be cast in concrete simply by the adoption of a constitution. They weren't just creating structures, they were creating a process. They were creating a culture of democracy. And we have been through crises in the past, and we've adjusted. In fact, the balance has been disrupted. We've had periods of terrible imbalance, and those have led to periods of redressing that imbalance, contest, adjustment, moving forward. And I hope that's where we're going to get to out of this period of crisis. But I have deep concern about it. I do think that civil society is key in this, and therefore philanthropy, both institutional and individual, is also essential, because that is the economy of civil society, if you will. Civil society, as de Tocqueville noted, of course, is a place where citizens come together themselves, under their own initiative, to work together, to form clubs, associations, to take on local projects, to learn from each other, to build their communities. And civil society is an important guarantor of the health of democracy. And one of the things I witnessed when I worked in Eastern Europe in the decade of the 1990s was that you could quickly establish the institutions of democracy. They moved very quickly to adopt new constitutions, to put in place parliaments, to put in place courts, to have freedom of the press, all things, of course, they hadn't had. And that was done, you know, in a relatively short period of time. But what was very hard for them, and still is creating the culture of democracy among the citizenry, to nurture and protect and refresh the democracy as challenges, social, economic, and other challenges challenge us. And you look at Hungary today, should have been one of the great success stories of the post-communist transition in Eastern Europe. And what you see is, because of weak civil society, a very authoritarian government operating largely through what we would, at least at the top level, consider democratic means, elections, constitutional amendments, is in fact squeezing out democracy in that country. So I read that article in Daedalus, and I took the point, because the author was arguing that concentrations of wealth exercised through philanthropy can also be distorting, as are concentrations of wealth exercised in other ways in our political process. But I really think we're in a moment of crisis. I think philanthropy and civil society have a very key role to play in helping us get through this period of crisis, as we have in the past in this country. And we need to bring the citizens back to the center. And I think that's a theme that all of the panelists have said right now, is that at the moment, one of the things that is out of balance in this country is the role of the citizens versus the role of special interests, moneyed interests, and institutions. And if we don't redress that imbalance, this democracy crisis may become a very serious one indeed.
I want to, we're going to move fairly soon to questions from the audience. There are a couple of things I'd like to have the panel discuss before we do. One is, I'll just toss these out. There are two areas that are in some ways extra institutional, although not quite. One we've alluded to a little bit, and that's the role of money in politics and the changing role of money now. My own bias is that we're heading into a new Gilded Age that may make the old Gilded Age look pale by comparison. But it also exaggerates the influence of a smaller group. And one element of this that I wrote about a few weeks ago is, if corporations are people, as the Supreme Court has said, and more corporations are losing an American identity. So they're not Americans, not only the inversions, but the fact is General Motors doesn't have to move abroad. Its interests as a global company are just very different. What's that going to do to the binds that we have together? The second part of this is about the media in a dramatically different age, where the business models favor tribal media. You make a whole lot more money if you aim at a small, ardent audience, and that's a tribal audience. And social media amplify some of those things, but it also means we're creating a nation where there isn't a common set of facts, and where some of the worst instincts get mobilized. So I throw those out there, and then I'd like to have a couple of minutes at least talking about where we might go from here in a set of problems that may be more cultural than they are structural, but it's harder to change culture than it is to change structures. So those are a bunch of ideas, and anybody can pick up on them if they want. Please do.
Can I pick up on something you, yes, good idea. Can I pick up on something that you talked about when we started the round, and I'll try to keep it brief, and that is something that's concerned me, and that is, you asked about the courts, and we see so many 5-4 decisions, and it seems to be such a political process. You rarely, if ever, see a person appointed to the federal judiciary, confirmed there who isn't pretty well identified with the party of the administration. Let me just pull a couple of things together. One is that, alluding back to what I started earlier about how the court has taken onto itself some very powerful functions of defining what's in the Constitution, which they can't even find any direct mandate for, except the very general power that cases that arise under the Constitution. Well, I think the end effect of that that they have exercised, whether they intended to or not, and I think some did intend to, quite frankly, political power. For instance, I mean, they have the power, we've seen in our own time, they have the power to, if not decide, come very close to deciding a presidential election in Bush v. Gore. They had the power to decide whether or not perhaps the most significant social welfare law, namely the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, whether or not that was constitutional. You could look in vain in the Constitution. Well, you could look and see that Congress was given the power to legislate in matters that affected commerce between the states or among the states, I think, et cetera. But that didn't tell you whether or not the Affordable Care Act was constitutional or not. So that I think that, therefore, the other parts of the government, or the political parts, see it increasingly as a political body, or a body that exercises political power. And so, therefore, the nomination and the confirmation processes become more attuned to politics and to looking about it as a political branch. And so, therefore, and this is the final part I see, I find it just very strange, and perhaps there's some avenues of looking in terms of the notion of people getting back much more of a grasp on their own government, that we still conduct our confirmation processes, or even the nomination processes. The pool is always very narrow. The person has to be from the right political spectrum and has to be relatively non-controversial. When you get to the confirmation, it's a kabuki dance, because every judge who gets up there, and I've gone to many of them, observed many of them, unfortunately participated, been the subject of a couple. The notion is, are you going to, the great thing is, are you going to make law? Oh, no, 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 Senator, I'm not going to make law. I'm going to find the law. I'm going to find the law. In that phrase, theoretically, that's in Article 3, it says cases arising under the Constitution. I'm going to just find the law that's there, and I'm going to look at what all my predecessors have said. I'm certainly not going to make the law. That, of course, is ridiculous, as every serious commentator has pointed out since time immemorial. So I guess the real my bottom line is, has it come time? I don't believe that nominees should be asked, for instance, how will you rule on X case? I appreciate that and how that would tend to diffuse their independence. But I do think you can make the confirmation process a more informative process in two ways, possibly. One, I don't think it would be amiss or fall amiss of a threat to their independence if you really began to ask the nominees, well, what are your theories about judicial power under the Constitution? Now, Chief Justice Roberts said in his confirmation, I'm an umpire. I just see how the ball's bat. Well, having been a judge myself for 20 years, I know that one just is out of the ballpark kind of thing. I mean, because, it's, you don't expect, I don't think the Founding Fathers expected that they would be totally dependent on the caliber of a couple of lawyers who came before them. Do you ask Scalia? He says, well, I'm an originalist. I don't believe that I believe we should look at the words of the Constitution and, just take their ordinary meaning. So when it says freedom of speech in the amendment, where does it say that includes freedom to spend unlimited amounts of money in a political campaign? I mean, you know, that's an interesting kind of originalism. You could take,
Original.
you could take Steve Breyer's somewhat more attractive, to me, theory of constitutional interpretation that try to look to the kind of values that the founders seek to accomplish by their words, and then you try to look at the consequences of a decision one way or another in the modern world, and you come to some, now that's mushy, it's mushy, but nonetheless. But I think that some kind of notion when these people who are going to be in those spots for the rest of their life, and interestingly enough, Supreme Court justices nowadays not only live longer, but they stay longer on the court. They're there for a long time, and certainly many of the current ones look that way. Seems to me the American people deserve at some point, without decreasing the necessity of independence, quote, in quotes, some notion of where these people are going to rule, and which would also bring in common good. Instead of looking at how successful a practitioner they were, or how successful a governmental employee they were, et cetera, you might have some kind of inquiry, you know, into where do you think your particular career has brought about, or how have you sought to instill notions of the common good or the public interest.
Mickey and then Steve.
Well, you know, I'm going to get off of the thing about Congress. And, you know, I've written a lot about this in my books and articles. So, but I think the real problem here that has to be addressed merges what Steve said and what Joel said. James Madison gave us a great blessing when he gave us this constitutional system. He also gave us a great curse. The blessing was a form of government in which the people themselves were ultimately in charge of what our country was going to be and do. The curse is that requires a certain kind of citizen. You know, in a place like the Soviet Union, all you had to do was know enough to stay out of the gulag. But here you have to have to sustain the kind of a society that Madison laid out for us. You have to have a sense of cultural responsibility. You have to have critical thinking and civic engagement and civic understanding. So we are in a crisis. I totally agree with Steve, but I don't think the answer is just democracy. It's just not, let's get everybody to the polls, because if you get people to the polls who don't understand anything about the system or what the government is supposed to do or what the powers are supposed to be and where, you know, you're not going to improve anything. So getting our education system back more in the direction that Joel Klein has been trying to take it for a very long time, and addressing what Steve has been saying about changing the culture. We honor in this country, we don't have a policy of shaming. So what we do is we honor, we salute very wealthy people who have made a great deal of money by either sponsoring violent video games or owning radio and television stations that, and I'm not going to name them, you know, that are pouring toxic poisons into the system. So we need to change, as Steve said, the culture. We need to we need to renew, I'm not going to say start over, we need to renew our sense of what a democracy is among the people themselves.
Steve, one last word, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Yeah, and I'll try to be brief because I'm really eager to have your questions. But I wanted to get to your point about economic power versus political power, because I think that is a major part of the current crisis. It's one of the things that is out of balance. And if you look at kind of the history and theory of democracy, a really strong and vibrant democracy rests on at least some consistent level of social cohesion, which, of course, is in many ways determined by economic cohesion. So if you get really large levels of economic inequality, you begin to see growing political inequality. And this is the point that I think we are at now. Now, Joel brought us back to the view of the American people, which for the first time in a very, very long time in polling, now we're very pessimistic about the future of their children. And this is extremely worrisome because it is counter to the American narrative. And I've been thinking a lot about the other periods of crisis in American democracy. And in particular, I've been reading a lot about the early part of the 20th century leading up to the progressive movement and through the progressive movement. And I came across a very interesting book by a German-American psychologist named Hugo Münsterberg that was written in 1904. It was called The Americans. And he said in that book, neither race nor tradition, nor the actual past binds the American to his countrymen, but rather the future which together they are building. And I don't think at the moment we can say that we together are building that future. And this is extremely worrisome.
Just one quick note on you, sort of how we go forward, because I think so many important points have been raised, and I commend Stephen for using the word crisis, which is often overused, but the cultural and other issues are critical. But I'll tell you one thing that we can do, which we're not doing, and that is we've got to stop having what I call zip code education. The kids with the greatest challenges in America are not remotely getting the education they will need to participate both in the 21st century global economy, high-tech economy, and in a civic society. And ultimately, I think what Stephen taught me, we all learned a big lesson. We were also optimistic about the Arab Spring, and how did that turn out for us? The democracy without institutions ends up being a very cruel and oftentimes very, very harmful way for our society to live. We are eroding institutions, and one of the bets we have got to make is in the 21st century that where a kid is born, what family she grows up in, what the color of her skin is, cannot determine the quality of her education. That's just a no-no.
And that's a good point at which to turn to the audience. So, do we have mics around? Okay. So, we have a question at the back there, and then one here. Please identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Barry Richardson. We came from Shreveport, Louisiana to hear this presentation. We're not really official. I'd like to present the problem at a different level. My wife's an activist in our little community, and we have a person running for school board in opposition to our ineffective school board. We went up and down our street, Delaware, inviting everyone on that street, most of whom had children, to come and meet a young woman who is interested in changing the nature of the school system we have. A delightful person, a talented person. How many people came to that meeting from our street? 0. The next morning I went up and got our local newspaper, and we get two. We get Wall Street Journal and our local paper. And the delivery man came about 6 o'clock. On our street, which is upper middle class street in a nice community, how many papers were delivered? 7 on the whole street. So I think we do have a crisis. I think we do have a problem. And it's easier to define it than to really make it work, not at the level that you sophisticated people are, but actually back in our community to get this democracy operating.
Let me just note in response to that, the giant Pew survey just done recently, which is probably the best that we've seen, that reflects on polarization, shows that there's still a vast middle in the country, but it's an uninvolved middle. The ones who are active in politics, engaged both in voting and giving to campaigns, and more generally, are the ones who are moving towards the polar ends. And so a good part of our challenge is to engage those in the middle, but as some political scientists have pointed out, in our tribal world now, what also happens is as people get more engaged, they tend to become more tribal. So we have a lot of challenges on that front. We had a question here and then one back there. Oh, I guess we're going, yeah. No, we need the mic for the streaming.
Okay. Good morning, and thank you for being here. I'm a middle school teacher. My name is Dan Cosgrove from West Virginia. So I'm hitting a lot of categories you mentioned, very poor students. I'm kind of frustrated because I teach my students. I teach them the foundation. We go through as much as possible with Civil War, Industrial Revolution. I do get off track. And they know about redistricting. They know about campaign finance. And they know that their vote doesn't really count. You know, the most basic, elementary, I think, topic for any social studies teacher is that one vote matters. And when they understand, and as we get more resources like from the CRN, I think they get more frustrated because everybody in this room, everybody in Capitol Hill, they know what's going on with the polarization. My students know it. And I think what I need is just the word crisis is important, but what do we do? What do I tell my students after I teach them as hard as I can how this country, how we can make it better where we're not doing what we're doing right now? So.
You know, first of all, thank you both for your comments. And there is obviously no simple solution or solution set to this complex problem. And there are some reasons for optimism, and I think we need to focus on those a bit because we look at the dysfunction and we look at the hyper-partisanship, we look at this crisis, and it's very demoralizing. And I think that's part of what your students are expressing. They don't feel that their voice matters, that their citizenship is taken seriously. And if we let that become the dominant narrative of American life, we have lost. So part of what I think we need to do, and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund is now incubating a project which we've been calling the National Purpose Initiative because I think we've lost our sense of shared national purpose. But what we're trying to do is kind of two things. One is to help people come together to create a more inspiring narrative about what this country is capable of doing. And we have the historical examples to draw on to re-inspire us to achieve what we need to achieve in the future. There are some very encouraging things happening in communities all across this country. I'm sorry you had the experience in Shreveport of not seeing neighbors come together to talk about an important issue, but fortunately there are millions of Americans, and there's been serious research conducted on this at Tufts and other places, are coming together in small groups in local communities and really working together on solving problems. The problem is it's not connected in any kind of national sense, and it doesn't reach the national level. So this narrative of dysfunction and decline is really taking root, and we need to tell these stories of success to help change the narrative. Now, the narrative is also based on lived experience. People are excluded, people are marginalized, and we have to recognize that as we attempt to shift the culture and shift the narrative. And then that leads me to the second part of our initiative, which is what Mickey said earlier. We're in a period of dysfunction in our political system, more so than in the institutions themselves. It's in the process that gets the people into the institutions. And so we are looking, using new technologies and new ideas, about how do you disrupt the current incentives that drive the culture and ethos and practice of American electoral campaigns. How do people get elected? Well, one thing they do to get elected is raise money. And we know that we're going to have to someday address campaign finance reform seriously, but we're never going to do that because the people who need to change those laws get elected with the campaign finance system that exists today. And they're not going to shoot the horse they rode in on. So we need to disrupt that process by inserting the citizens more effectively in the campaign process and begin to change the culture and practice of campaigning so that we are really truly talking about representative government.
Yeah, let me add to that. I think I think to change the political system and make Congress work better requires some actually fundamental changes in the laws, the election laws. But I would say to your students that one of the things that's still very much alive in this country is citizen action, not necessarily through the Congress, through the legislatures. It still works. And you talk about changing the election system. In California and in Washington State, the citizens themselves, through initiative petitions, totally changed their system, how people get nominated, how they got rid of party control of redistricting. You know, so whether it's something like the Lilly Ledbetter Act on equal pay, which came from women's action outside of the legislature and made its way into the legislature, or Mothers Against Drunk Driving, or any of these kinds of things, your students can get engaged and can make change. It's, it may be frustrating that their one vote in an election might not change the outcome, but that doesn't mean that they can't change things in America. That civic engagement is still very much alive.
Teach them to lead. Leaders change what's happening. And if you empower children, and each one of them has the reality that they can lead and change, whether it's in Shreveport in Louisiana or someplace else. And if the country is going to go through the kind of things that it needs to go through, we're going to have leaders who are willing, first of all, not to be popular for the moment, and second of all, think there's something larger than the next election that matters to the country.
I am somewhat concerned about some of the research I read, which suggests that people are more and more moving to be with people that they feel good about being with, like themselves, us and them. And it seems to me that of course, can taint the school systems as well, because most of our school systems are, neighborhood-based. So I think one of the things that maybe have to look for, because I happen to think, maybe being the mother of 5 and grandmother of 10 little kids, that you do have to start very early to have those conversations with the kids about getting out of the us and them kind of thing, because they're going to bring home all the mores and all the things of their peers that they see all the time, and some mechanisms for exposing kids at a very early age to seeing the problems of the viewpoints of the good points in people from other walks of life. Because Joel, leaders are good, but our leaders are pretty much coming from one segment of the population right now, and I think it's not entirely, but a lot. And I think it's very important that those leaders, but come from a wider segment, but also that they understand from a very early age they get to play the roles, and they get to see of what other kids with a totally different point of view are undergoing.
We have just time for one more question, I'm afraid, and this gentleman over there has been waiting.
I'm Tony Fowler, and I'm with the U.S. Department of Education. But from what I see, it seems to me that the 3 branches of government have been stepping outside of the bounds of their enumerated powers. And so what you have really are there's a lot of confusion about the roles of government, because it seems like the branches are overstepping the bounds of what the Congress basically tells them to do. And so from my perspective, it seems to me that if we could get those branches to get back into their constitutional roles that are enumerated and described in the Constitution, and I don't know how you do that, but simply when you have legislature that's doing something other than legislating, when you have a judiciary that's making up laws, when you have an executive that's acting outside of the bounds of the restrictions that are set upon them in the Constitution, it seems to me that causes a whole lot of problems and perhaps contributes to where we are today. So I'd just like to hear your thoughts about that.
We will have to actually abbreviate the discussion a little bit. I would just note, You know, the great constitutional scholar Edward Corwin had his famous phrase that it's, the Constitution is an invitation to struggle between the branches. Powers are enumerated, but it's not entirely clear, and I think Pat made that clear as well. And what it requires is a culture where people respect the other institutions, to some degree respect their own boundaries. One of the things we're seeing now is you get an increased use of executive power if you have a Congress that basically says, if you're for it, we're against it. And it encourages behavior that moves beyond the boundaries. You have a judicial branch, you have a Congress that basically decided it couldn't make laws, so they pushed a lot of decisions off onto the courts, deliberately added to those powers. But then we've seen political branches that decide to choose justices, and almost always they're judges because they're the only ones you can trust. You know what their behavior is going to be. That moves it in a very different direction. So we can use our hortatory powers to call on them to get back to where they belong, but we're also going to have to change our broader political culture, and that's one of our great challenges. And I want to add one little note here. One of the things that I'm hoping to do with working with Ken Burns and Sandra Day O'Connor, Lamar Alexander, and Michael Bennett, is to get a series of contests focused on middle school students around the country, probably state by state, having kids pick one thing that they believe is not working in our broader political environment, and one idea that would do something about it. Would get them thinking about these things and maybe even get them focused a little bit on what they could do to implement change. So civic education and contest work gets people's juices flowing are some of the things that we hope we can do, and get the Civics Renewal Network engaged in this as well. Any last comment from our panelists? And then we move on to a very special treat after lunch with Roe Adams.
Norm, if I can make one quick, it's kind of a challenge to everybody here, because I'm really struck by what Steve has been talking about our culture. Just ask yourselves, well, I'm not going to have a show of hands. How many of you move in a social circle in which there are a lot of people whose views differ from each other? Because most of us have a tendency to hang with people who think the way we do, vote the way we do, read what we read. You're either watch Fox all the time and hate the people on the other side, or you watch MSNBC and hate people on the other side. You know, we have, as Pat said, we have become people who've separated ourselves too. It's not just at the political level. And so we have a challenge to make sure that we engage regularly with other points of view, listen to them, listen, not just talk, not form rebuttals when the other person is talking, but listen honestly to them. So that's the challenge I would put back out to the audience.
Thanks very much.